Welcome to China Insider, I'm David Zhang. Now, the trip by Nancy Pelosi to visit Taiwan will be underway by the time tomorrow morning. But for now, the plane has landed in Taipei, and she's well on her way into her rest before she gets to meet the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen. This trip has been very controversial for various reasons, and rightly so, as many have pointed out. Was this trip even worth it, and should she have gone? Now, normally, a trip like this doesn't actually violate any of its U.S. policy against Taiwan, and therefore a trip by any Congress members would actually warrant quite not that much of a story, to be fair. But because she is the House Speaker, and she is going in an official capacity with her delegation, this trip has been upplayed by various factors. First of all, the Chinese Communist Party has made various threats, escalating in each time, and they've actually been quite credible threats, and which caused the White House to worry. But before we get to that, we kind of have to criticize the White House, because the reason this trip has been blown out of proportion, it is precisely because of a mixed messaging from the White House. Before this trip even went underway, the trip itself was leaked to the public via the press by a member of the White House who didn't want her to go on this trip. And the trip then was interpreted by the White House as the message that if she goes, it could be provocative to start a war with China. However, we know that the policy, the long-standing policy the United States has for Taiwan is the Taiwan's Relations Act, which basically means that you are allowed to visit Taiwan in some diplomatic capacity as a member of the House or a member of the Senate. And we've seen before, this year and last year, members of the Senate and the House have formed delegations and visited Taiwan. But the difference back then was that the trip itself was largely unknown until they've landed in Taipei. Nancy Pelosi, this time going on the trip, has brought so much attention into the threat China has brought to the table. From the initial, if she goes, there could be military confrontation, to then suggesting that they could shoot down her plane, to now saying that potentially they could invade Taiwan and cause a Taiwan Strait crisis. And even as she's preparing for Asia trip, there was actually live fire exercises done just off the coast of China, very much close to the Taiwan island. And all of these leads to us to think that China is ready for war. But in reality, they're not. And here's why. The Chinese Communist Party has a strategy for Taiwan. The topmost priority is to win without firing a single shot. And that goes with other countries as well. And you can see this in its unrestricted warfare doctrine, which is to win by all means necessary other than directly using military, which is seen as an inferior strategy if they can fire without a shot. The second point is that for Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party would prefer to invade and attack Taiwan behind the backs of the United States or without the United States reacting. So for them to be able to say that we're going to shoot down a plane carrying Nancy Pelosi and her delegation is an act of war against the United States, not against Taiwan. That means if the US is attacked, would that also mean Japan, Australia, the allies, the staunch allies, perhaps even the UK would respond? And if the House Speaker, who is the third in line for the presidency, is killed in action or her plane was shot down, that's actually going to trigger a bipartisan response in the United States. Of course, that scenario we never want to see because that's going to war with China. But that goes against every single planning and military planning or brain strategy, strategizing against the idea of invading Taiwan by the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, for China to go and say, we are going to use the military, that's very much the last straw that they're going to use. Now, let's go talk about the White House a little bit more. They've been adapting to this concept called strategic ambiguity when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to military, when it comes to anything that has to do with foreign policy and national security. Strategic ambiguity is the concept that we don't really tell you exactly what we want, and our actions will only reflect those that we prefer is kept to ourselves until the moment is right. So this is kind of the situation with the strategic ambiguity aspect, is that you never know what's going to happen. Now, from a dictator or an authoritarian leader's perspective, when you're left to guess the risk, you usually try to make something that's either a miscalculation or a good calculation. And so half of the time, you're actually trying to risk ruining your whole regime just based on the fact that you're going to invade. So for Saddam Hussein, he later found out that the US was going to intervene in the Gulf War. And then we've seen this during the Korean War as well, where the US policy toward South Korea and North Korea were that of ambiguity. And that caused North Koreans to say that, well, we can take a risk and we can take a gamble and we'll go invade South Korea and see what happens. And then the United States went to war. Now, when it comes to China, this is actually, I think Taiwan is the most representative of strategic ambiguity. The Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 communique, and the 6 assurance are these so-called guiding principles that guide the Taiwan and US relationship, and in turn they guide the US-China relationship on Taiwan. When it comes to those 3 doctrines or the policies, it says that the US will defend Taiwan, but they won't officially recognize the island as a self-governing democracy or a country. And in doing so, they make it quite unclear as to what they will do if China attacks. In the past, we've seen that there's been at least 3 Taiwan Strait crises, and each time the US did come in and say that they will use military force to ensure the peace and safety across the Taiwan Strait. But every single time, it has been the guessing game that the US and China has to play on each other. So this time when the White House says, well, we don't think it's a good idea that Pelosi should go, and then the Pentagon says, well, if there's anything, we'll try to formulate a plan for the trip, it sends a mixed signal to the Chinese Communist Party. So what do they do in return? They send a message of threat. They say, well, if you come, we're going to do something, we're going to shoot down the plane, right? Of course, now Pelosi actually went, and they didn't cave into the threat of China, which is good. Had they done so and caved in and said, by the way, we're not going to visit Taiwan, we're going to skip the trip, what would that do to what potentially could have been a bluffing move by the Chinese Communist Party to test the willingness of the administration? Actually saw that, well, Biden said they're going to cave in, they're going to cave into the threat, they're not going to go. That's a huge disappointment and the discredibility to what the United States stands for. Now, let's talk about the escalation of threat. China says, well, we're going to shoot your plane down. The US says, well, we'll make contingency plans. We're going to send our carriers. We're going to send our jets. We're going to send everything so that we can protect the speaker. Great. Now China has nowhere to go but to go escalate this threat to another level. They will do live fire exercise across from Taiwan. And then this in turn actually dramatically increases the chance of the 2 sides actually going into a military conflict because you didn't make it clear from the get-go what your intentions are and what you're intending to do. So that's the downside of strategic ambiguity, is that until you get to the point, let's look at Ukraine, for example. The long-standing policy is that the US won't send troops to Ukraine, and they didn't really make it clear what the US policy is for Ukraine. So Russia's Vladimir Putin says, well, we're going to take a gamble, we're going to invade Ukraine and see what happens. Right? After 72 hours, the invasion hasn't succeeded yet. The blitzkrieg failed. And so the United States decided that now it's time to help Ukraine. So strategic ambiguity brings a lot of unwarranted negative consequences to its actions. And this we can see from its showing across Taiwan, Ukraine, and various times during history. Strategic clarity, on the other hand, says exactly what it wants to do, which is if you're going to do something, we're going to respond this way. If Pelosi will visit Taiwan, we're going to respond in a certain way that ensures that the Chinese Communist Party knows from the get-go what our messages are and how the United States will respond. I say that the Chinese aren't going to invade Taiwan, or they're not going to shoot down the plane. What are they going to do? Well, they're likely going to punish Taiwan for becoming the recipient of the speaker. And that's the important part here, which is that the Taiwanese are going to end up bearing some of the cost of an American action. So, for example, they have banned more than 100 firms from imports into China, and this is going to, again, place Taiwan, like last year, into an economic battle with China's coercive activity, which is using money, using trade relations to pressure diplomatic responses from another country. Now, last year, they banned imports of Taiwanese pineapples, and that caused a huge stir. And this time, they're going to ban more imports using their classic economic warfare to deter the Taiwanese, which I believe at this point isn't as effective as they hope. Now, the trip itself, let's kind of talk about how symbolic it really is. Had the trip gone unnoticed or reported afterwards, I think it would have not caused so much dominance in the news cycle today, but rather it would have just been another trip, right? Now, it is now symbolic because her trip going to Taiwan is representative of the U.S. policy toward Taiwan, or how friendly the United States is toward Taiwan to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Another point is, had there been any sort of military confrontation, the Chinese Communist Party would have actually done something against Taiwan rather than against the United States. So things like flying military planes across the air defense identification zone, or crossing the median line, which is divide between the Taiwan and Chinese airspace. And those actions, once again, are towards Taiwan and not really towards the United States, because China is not willing to go to war with the United States right now. So what exactly are the reasons that they won't go to war? For one, the Chinese Communist Party has to be fully prepared before they're willing to risk a global warfare that could cause World War III. And second, Xi Jinping himself needs to have enough legitimate support within the party to actually say that this invasion or this military conflict with the United States is worth it. The speaker going to Taiwan also doesn't really change the fact that there will be any changes in policies themselves, as we know that the Taiwan Relations Act already has been managing and essentially controlling the way that the U.S. Congress and its White House, the legislative and the executive branch, how they've been approaching the Taiwan issue for almost 40 years. So it's not like something that can just change overnight with her visit. So in the end, I think what really blew this whole thing out of proportion, it was actually on the Chinese Communist Party's ever-escalating threat level to the American people, the politicians from the United States, as well as the entire country, because all they've been doing this whole time is making the problem seem more concerning and serious than they actually are, just in hope that the US would cave in and not go. Now, they didn't achieve the result intended because now Pelosi is in Taiwan. So the next step is to see how they will end up retaliating and punishing Taiwan for accepting the trip. And this seems to be the problem here. Will the United States support Taiwan to continue to give its resources and everything to support Taiwan to overcome this turbulent period to follow their trip? Because I think the worst thing to do is to make the trip just as a symbolic trip that say, we support you guys, this is what we're gonna do for you guys, but not really show any actionable assistance to the country, knowing that they will be facing certain retaliations and certain punishments from the Chinese Communist Party. Whether that's military, financial, or even cyber, as we know, they seems to have been all over the place trying to deter Taiwan from accepting the trip. This is actually going to be the key point to watch going forward, is whether or not the United States under this administration is willing to provide the right assistance to Taiwan, including arms sales, including a proper trade agreement, and including things that would benefit the society of Taiwan. For example, things that would promote a clearer policy, whether or not Taiwanese people should see the United States as an ally of Taiwan, and whether or not the United States even has the will to commit to a fight in Taiwan should an actual invasion come. The important takeaway of this entire trip is the US side has to be more clear about what they want or what they really will do. The Chinese side should probably evaluate the way they do things, as every single time they make more threats, it seems to make more Americans and everybody around the world hate them that much more, because these threats end up not benefiting the Chinese Communist Party or benefiting anybody else. And for the Taiwanese, I think this is a chance to reflect on the US commitment to Taiwan, and it seems the Pelosi trip is going to reaffirm that, but what's going to come after that? Is going to be more support, more assistance, and will that actually ultimately help the Taiwanese people to defend against the China threat? With China's strongman strategy, it's very much you have to keep getting more aggressive. And that's really in the nature of the authoritarian regime, because you can't be seen internally as weak, right? So all you do is you keep escalating the threat level until it gets to the point where it's kind of awkward for you. Think about diplomacy, right? You're supposed to make sure that both sides can have a way to out of this awkward position, or you're riding up the diplomatic stairs. You have to come down from it, right? So if your threat level is so high that you're unable to commit to that threat level, say the invasion, well then it seems like you've actually shown that you're weak and you're unwilling to fulfill what you've promised to the people. So for the Chinese Communist Party, that's why propaganda has been so wild for this particular trip. It's because they're really trying to show off that they're strong, and they're using their so-called warrior diplomacy to coerce the US into caving in. So the only way for the United States to respond is not to cave in, but to rather say, well, we're actually going to follow our own policy, and the United States has no reason to listen to the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to its own affairs, and that the Chinese Communist Party cannot meddle in the United States' own internal affairs when it comes to relations with another country or with Taiwan. And so when we see that Pelosi meets President Tsai tomorrow, it's going to reaffirm this idea that the United States has its own sovereign, seems rather strange to have to emphasize, but it has its own sovereign understandings of the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. As well, the symbolic position of the Speaker of the House, as we know, 25 years ago, then Speaker Newt Gingrich actually also did the visit in Taiwan. But he only stayed for a few hours to meet with Lee Teng-hui, then President of Taiwan. But this time, Nancy Pelosi will actually stay overnight, commit a meeting in the morning, and then tour around until she leaves for Japan afterwards. So this really is the chance for us to see how willing is China to punish the United States or to punish Taiwan directly. And we know that so far, they've all really been doing is talking. And thank you so much for watching tonight. This is China Insider. I'm David Zhang. See you next time.